An idea is something that can be born in your mind, but, unfortunately, may never materialize or see the light of day if you don't take any action. Today, we want to tell you about a man who proved through hard work that an idea, fueled by strong desire, can become reality, coming into existence as the result of deep faith in yourself and your own abilities. Our hero was born on February 24, 1955, and his life didn't start off easy. As a child, he was abandoned by his biological mother and put up for adoption. However, he wasn't without a home for long. Before long, he found a new family. He was adopted by a married couple, Paul and Clara Jobs. They couldn't have children of their own, so they decided to take in a child and raise him as their own. In his new family, Paul and Clara named their adopted son Steve. Remarkably, from an early age, Steve was a gifted child, uniquely combining a sense of adventure, curiosity, and an exceptional drive to explore and discover. As time went on, Steve grew up like an ordinary boy, but by around the age of 12, both he and his adoptive parents began to notice that he was incredibly drawn to electronics. One day, he showed initiative by offering to help his physics teacher build a device to measure the frequency of electric current for the classroom. For many adults, those words still sound complicated, but young Steve was already deeply interested in such things. The only obstacle he faced was a lack of resources. He didn't have all the necessary parts, and most people would have simply given up. But not our hero. The boy came up with a rather unusual solution. He picked up a phone book and called William Hewlett. Many of you probably recognize that last name. The man on the other end of the line was the CEO of the well-known company Hewlett-Packard. Can you imagine that? A 12-year-old kid didn't panic, gathered his courage, and called someone who could have easily laughed and hung up without even listening. Instead, Steve managed to impress Hewlett. After a 20-minute conversation, Hewlett sent a driver to the boy's house with all the parts he needed, finding their discussion genuinely interesting. Later that summer, Steve was invited to intern at HP by William Hewlett himself. While still in school, Steve made a friend who shared his interests, and together they worked on what they loved most. Electronics brought them together, and both Steve's, Jobs, and Wozniak could spend days soldering and experimenting. Later on, they attended lectures and completed internships together at HP. After graduating from school, Wozniak stayed with the company, this time as an engineer. Everyone who truly loves their work dives into it completely, giving their soul, time, and energy while dreaming of something greater. Wozniak dreamed of creating his own personal computer. Jobs, however, chose a different path and decided not to tie himself to the company where his friend worked. He joined Atari, but this time as a video game designer. However, his enthusiasm quickly faded. Steve decided to walk away, simply leaving everything behind. Choosing a path of self-discovery, he traveled to India with his hippie friends. As he later said, those were the days when everything completely wears you out, when you want to buy a one-way ticket and disappear. Disappear from everyone. It was a period of rebirth, absolutely necessary to regain strength and find fresh ideas. Wozniak, on the other hand, stayed behind and became one of the founders of the Homebrew Computer Club, known only within narrow circles of electronics and radio enthusiasts. But Wozniak's efforts were not in vain. In 1975, he created what he had been striving for over so many years. The first prototype of a personal computer was proudly presented to the company he had been connected with since his school days. Unfortunately, and to his great disappointment, things didn't go as planned. The invention was rejected. This deeply upset Wozniak. Still, he refused to give up and turned to Atari, where his friend had once worked as a designer. To his even greater disappointment, the company rejected the invention as well, considering it unprofitable and unlikely to generate any real revenue. As Wozniak later recalled, people have always tended to doubt anything new, and his invention was no exception. After suffering failure due to people's fear of innovation and their preference for stability and predictable income, Wozniak found himself at a dead end. Naturally, he could no longer continue working for those companies, as he saw no point in it. The work of several years had simply been laughed at. It's hard to say how events might have unfolded next, but at that very moment, When Wozniak was feeling crushed and humiliated, the prodigal son and hippie all in one returned from India. Of course, the first thing he did was visit his friend Wozniak, who told him about both his achievements and the failure of his creation. That evening, they spent a long time thinking things through, analyzing every possible option. In the end, after gathering their courage, Jobs suggested taking their own independent path and starting a company of their own. It was at that moment that two unknown guys from the outskirts began a new chapter in their lives, a chapter that, years later, would turn out to be a road to success. On April 1st, 1976, while sitting at home with friends, Steve was brainstorming possible company names reflecting on his time in India. Since Jobs had become fascinated with an apple-based diet after returning from India, he suggested calling the company Apple. Once again, Jobs' intuition proved right. He clearly understood that the first letters of the name would place the company ahead of Atari in the phone book. At a time when the internet didn't exist, the phone directory was the main link between people and businesses. That same day, the company's first logo was created, depicting Isaac Newton sitting under an apple tree. But all of this existed only on paper. What they truly needed was a product, the crown of their work. That first product became Wozniak's personal computer design, the very one that HP and Atari had so easily rejected. The Apple I, that was the name of their child, required the first serious sacrifices and investments from Jobs. He sold his beloved van, and in the end, the team had $1,300 in hand, which became a crucial and valuable investment in the company's very first product. You have to start somewhere, and most importantly, not out in the open. With no alternatives at the time, they decided to use Jobs' home as their first workspace. Steve was living with his parents then, and Clara Jobs didn't stay on the sidelines. She even joined her son's team. She took on the role of secretary, answering phone calls, which gave the company a sense of legitimacy and the appearance of a serious organization. Every company faces constant competition. The trio encountered their first real competitor, the Altair 8800. It was assembled by hand and used toggle switches to enter commands. The results were displayed as combinations of lights on the front panel. The more complex the task, the more switches had to be flipped, sometimes hundreds or even more. If a mistake was made, the user ended up with incorrect calculations and had to start all over again. Still, at the time, this kind of computing machine was perfect for scientists and for anyone who wanted to get a glimpse of the future. The Apple I, however, had a clear advantage over its competitor. At the very least, it featured a keyboard for input and a display that allowed users to actually see the results. As funny as it may sound, some of the very first Apple I units were assembled right in Steve's bedroom. No industrial machinery, no modeling equipment, no fancy tools. A bedroom, hands, a sharp mind, and imagination. That was their entire setup. But where were they supposed to sell this technological miracle? That's when the first real difficulties appeared. No one wanted to buy the new technology. Store after store turned them down. Only one small shop owner agreed to take the product, and even then, only on consignment. Surprisingly, the new device sold out in just 1 week. That's when the guys realized that they needed more space to scale production. The decision was made to move into the garage at Jobs' house. The Apple I sold for $666.66. This number wasn't chosen by accident. It was one of Wozniak's quirks. But when it came to sales, Jobs was always the one in charge. The very first batch of 100 computers was sold to local customers, providing Apple with a solid contribution to its initial budget. However, to grow the company and increase production, new funds were desperately needed, and that challenge also fell on Jobs. Wozniak and the rest of the team focused mainly on manufacturing and the technical side of the project. When it came to money and promotion, everyone relied solely on Jobs. There were moments when Jobs was ready to give up. The situation came dangerously close to shutting down production altogether due to a complete lack of funding. Jobs even stopped communicating with people, staying in his room for days at a time, calling bank after bank in search of financial support. Every single one of them turned him down. But when hope was almost gone, Steve finally managed to find the right person, someone who agreed to become an investor, adding another $92,000 to the budget and later providing a $250,000 line of credit from Bank of America. The sense of growing success was unmistakable. Everyone on the team was happy with the progress. Jobs was incredibly proud of how each idea was being brought to life. At last, Wozniak had complete freedom to work. Nothing stood in the way of pursuing long-desired developments and fully immersing himself in the work he loved without being limited by budget constraints. That's how, in 1980, the Apple II was born. The updated model introduced color graphics. Wozniak also added the Disk II controller, a basic DOS, and a file system. There's no denying it. The new Apple II caused a sensation. This model made the company's founders millionaires and finally opened the door for Apple to enter the US stock market. But life is unpredictable. Where there are highs, there are also lows. In 1981, Wozniak's plane crashed during takeoff. Miraculously, he survived. However, his recovery forced development to stop for 2 full years. The reason was that Wozniak suffered from amnesia and couldn't remember anything he had been working on before the accident. After the incident, Jobs didn't rush back to work either. He decided to focus on his education, enrolling under a pseudonym. However, by 1983, he returned to the company and once again began working on innovative projects. Going public marked not only a new stage of growth for the company, but also a sense of discomfort for Jobs. Steve was a natural leader by nature. Yet because the company's operating capital was largely borrowed, the board of directors tightened its control and behaved as if they were the true owners. The brilliant founder of the company remained just one of its managers. The most important and distinctive trait of Steve was his incredibly powerful energy, the ability to motivate people united by a common goal, to inspire them and clearly communicate his ideas. The project made him an icon for engineers, employees, and everyone connected to the industry. Once, a close friend of Bill Gates mentioned that even he had bought a Macintosh and was actively using it. Steve's growing ideology, driven by a passionate desire to create a flawless product, put enormous pressure on the entire staff. He pushed everyone to deliver the absolute maximum they were capable of. He was completely obsessed with work and success. He often slept in his office just so he wouldn't waste time commuting in the morning. Tension and competition in the market kept increasing. At that point, Jobs came up with the idea of hiring John Sculley, the former CEO of the world-famous Pepsi company, to run Apple. Sculley was a highly successful top executive and had built a strong reputation as a brilliant marketer. However, this decision turned out to be a mistake. By bringing in someone who didn't share Jobs' vision of management, Jobs effectively invited a rival into the company. In 1985, largely due to Sculley's influence, the board of directors made the decision to fire Jobs himself. After Jobs' departure, things at Apple didn't immediately fall apart. The company was able to stay afloat thanks to Steve's remaining developments and, over the next 12 years, the ongoing development and promotion of its own operating system. A serious problem, however, was the rapid decline in Apple's stock. People even began speculating about which of the major tech giants might eventually acquire what was left of the once great company. During this time, Steve was far from idle. He focused all his energy on promoting his new creation, the company NeXT, whose mission was to develop its own operating system and build computers aimed primarily at scientific and academic work. You might be surprised to learn that Pixar was also under the leadership of our genius at that time. It was during this period that the studio released such hits as Toy Story and Monsters, Inc. Steve's efforts, combined with the effective work of top managers, took the company to unprecedented heights. And on December 20th, 1996, Apple decided to acquire NeXT for a staggering $429 million. Just take a moment to think about that number. But there was one condition: the acquisition would automatically bring Jobs back to the company as CEO. Under his leadership, a major cleanup began, staff reductions, and the elimination of outdated products and projects. Jobs couldn't shake the thought that if he hadn't been fired from Apple, he might never have experienced a new rise and personal growth in an environment where nothing is guaranteed. It was a powerful lesson, one that taught him how to truly move towards success. The first iMac was introduced to the world on August 15, 1998. Soon after, the now famous OS X was developed. A year later, Apple unveiled the iBook, which carried the same design language as the iMac. Looking at it today, it might seem a bit odd, but at the time, it was a flagship innovation for the company. In 2001, Apple sparked a revolution in the music industry. That was the year the world saw the first iPod and the opening of Apple stores. The player became the best-selling device thanks to its design, ease of use, compact size, and intuitive controls. In 2003, Apple followed up with the launch of the iTunes Store. Jobs was the first to propose buying music track by track, allowing users to listen anytime, both on a computer and on the iPod itself. At that point, everything became clear. Technology was moving to a new level, offering an entirely new user experience. Gradually moving away from traditional input methods, Apple introduced touch-based interaction. And that brings us to the most significant moment in the brand's history, the 2007 presentation that introduced the world to the very first iPhone. An unprecedented breakthrough, just a couple of taps, and you had access to any function you needed. That presentation remains, to this day, an icon of public speaking, showcasing Steve's extraordinary talent as a presenter. Just a year later, in 2008, the world was introduced to the MacBook Air. Thin, lightweight, impressively power-efficient, and at the same time built with an incredibly durable body, it featured the now famous hinge that allowed the laptop to be opened with just one finger. Steve had no intention of stopping there. In 2010, the first iPad was unveiled. Then, in August 2011, the company reached a historic milestone. Apple became the most valuable company in the world. Only an achievement of that magnitude allowed Steve to announce his resignation from the position he had fought so hard to reclaim. He achieved everything one could possibly dream of. He handed his position over to Tim Cook, who took over leadership of the company. Today, Apple is a market leader on every continent. In just one quarter of 2019, Apple's revenue amounted to $64 billion, and it is hardly possible to find a person on the planet who does not know this brand. Steve Jobs and his legacy still show the world that nothing is impossible, and no matter how difficult and thorny the path to a goal may be, it can be reached if you devote yourself entirely to your dream. In 2003, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, yet even in that condition, he devoted most of his time to the work he loved. Steve passed away at around 3 p.m. on October 5, 2011, at his home in California due to respiratory failure. He died surrounded by his loved ones, his wife, children, and sister. According to his family, Jobs passed peacefully, and his last words, spoken a few hours before his death, were, "Oh, wow." After learning the story of this man, it is hard to imagine that an ordinary guy named Steve Jobs could become, for millions of people around the world, an icon of public speaking and the genius of his generation. Everything truly brilliant is first born in our minds, and the real question is what each of us does to turn those dreams into reality. Friends, share your thoughts on how you personally feel about this man and his creations as a whole. See you soon.